All right. How is everyone doing this evening? Good. It's great to see you. We have a wonderful crowd. I'm Anthony Crowell, the Dean and President here at New York Law School, and we have a very special program this evening with Arvind Sohoni, the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at the New York City Housing Authority, place we all know as NYCHA. Arvind's going to present a very timely and important overview on the history of public housing in New York City, and I am grateful that he is joining us today. I have been awaiting this presentation because I have the benefit of being married to the general counsel of NYCHA, and he and the NYCHA CEO were cooing one day about Arvind's presentation to the staff at the authority about which he's going to deliver today. And I just thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for all of us to benefit from this rich history and perspective on the authority, because NYCHA is undergoing such seismic changes. It's important for all of us as New Yorkers to be as invested in its history as much as we must be invested in its future. NYCHA is the largest public housing authority in the nation, and it's home to 1 in 17 New Yorkers. So it's an essential part of our city government and also one of the most complex and unique entities there could be. Tonight's program is, I'm happy to say, part of the Center for New York City Law's expansion of its programming as it celebrates 30 years as one of the premier places for substantive dialogue and programs within New York's civic community. The center is led by our extraordinary founder and director, Professor Ross Sandler. Where is Ross? And I must mention his extraordinary spouse, Alice, who has been a mainstay during these 30 years. And they have been very informally saying this is a Jubilee year celebration, 30 years. It's wonderful. And we are expanding the center's reach thanks to new additions to our team, including Ben Max, who is our program director and executive editor, who's going to be introducing Arvind in just a second, and Stephen Lewis, who recently retired from the city as one of the members of the executive team at the City Law Department and chief of the Legal Counsel Division. He is a distinguished fellow in state and local government law and counsel to the Center for New York City Law. We also have senior fellow Jeff Weiss, who directs the Census and Redistricting Institute, and city land editor Veronica Rose, and our wonderful city law administrative coordinator Rose White. I am very grateful to their efforts creating this powerful team, and we are creating many, many exciting opportunities to engage all of you and to move our city forward through the power of information and dialogue. If anyone here has thoughts about how you'd like to contribute to our publications and our programs, or wanted to discuss possible partnerships or events, I encourage you to find one of our team members. Email me. My email address is on the website. We want to make sure that we're engaging all of you to serve New York as best as we can. And finally, as you'll see on your tables, we want to encourage all of you to join us at this coming Tuesday's, it's March 5th, this coming Tuesday's important city law breakfast, which Ross hosts with Matthew Ketchke, the president of Con Edison of New York. And that's an entity like NYCHA that is so critical to the infrastructure and future of our city and state. I'm going to hand this over to Ben, who's formally going to introduce Arvind and to begin this program. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I look forward to a robust dialogue and one in which we all learn a lot and invest ourselves even more deeply in the future of New York City's public housing system.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here tonight. Great turnout. I'm very excited to hear from our speaker. In just one moment, I won't talk for too long. Don't worry. Thank you, Dean Crowell, for the welcome and for inviting me to join New York Law School. I'm very excited to be here. I've been here just a few months, very happy to be working with Dean Crowell and, of course, with founder and director of the Center for New York City Law, Ross Sandler, who is a great partner. and happy to be learning from him and the rest of the team, celebrating 30 years this year and expanding our programming. This is going to be one of a number of events we'll host this year and beyond, where we are trying to bring in emerging leaders in government, sometimes people who you might not be familiar with their name, but they have very interesting things to say. And we're hoping that Arvind tonight will be exactly that. And we're very excited to have him here. And then people will start to know those names, and they become the next household names in New York policy and civic affairs. And we're also very excited to be bringing more people to the law school for conversations, for participation. We're going to do events in a variety of formats to make sure to bring various voices into the law school and connect with as many communities as we can, and talk about a wide range of policy issues, as we have been at the Center for New York City Law for many years, and as are covered in City Law and City Land, the publications of the center, and discussed at City Law breakfasts, and we'll be doing at these evening events as well, with some afternoon events mixed in too. I'll also mention, as part of coming into the Center for New York City Law here at New York Law School, I've been hosting a podcast on policy and politics in New York called Max Politics, which is another offering that we bring to you and the New York civic-minded public. And I actually, about 6-8 months ago now, speaking of NYCHA, had the CEO, Lisa Bova-Hyatt, and the board chair, Jamie Rubin, on the show. That conversation's still very relevant and timely if you're interested in more NYCHA conversation after this tonight. Very focused in that conversation with some of the programs where I think Arvind's presentation tonight will sort of finish. So giving us a lot of the history leading up to the moment that we're in now. Let me take just a quick moment to thank the other indispensable members of our Center for New York City Law team who helped put this event together. Dean Crowell mentioned Rose White and Veronica Rose, but they really did so much to make tonight happen. So thank you both. And of course, the great marketing and events teams here at New York Law School. All right, so Arvind Sohoni is with us tonight, this evening, presenting what promises to be a very interesting talk, American Castles, 90 Years of Public Housing in New York, Grand Ideals, Broken Promises, and Renewed Commitments in the City's Existential Challenge to House 500,000 New Yorkers, 500,000 plus, probably. As I bring Arvind up momentarily, I'll mention, since we're here at the law school, that he is a graduate of Harvard Law. Currently, he is Executive Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, where he oversees the agency's transformation effort, including the restructuring of the authority and exploration of new business models to sustain the core mission of housing low-income New Yorkers. He also works with various stakeholders to coordinate the agency's response to a 2019 regulatory agreement, working closely with federal partners at HUD, U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, and an appointed monitor. As an advocate for resident decision-making, he has led several reforms to decentralize the agency to local control and a focus on resident needs. Arvind joined the Housing Authority after several years as a consultant with McKinsey & Company, where he served a variety of private and public sector clients, including government agencies, nonprofits, movie studios, and television networks. Arvind will go into much more detail on NYCHA, its history, its present, its future. But I'll briefly say, as a journalist who has covered NYCHA for roughly a decade plus, as a generalist, so not consistently as a beat, I've watched officials, elected, appointed, really struggle with what to do about public housing in New York, really struggle to come up with solutions, really struggle to implement plans that have been in place. Very often, officials, where I focused at the city and state levels, hoping for tens of billions of dollars from the federal government that just simply hasn't been coming. And so it's a really important moment to finally see a lot of things moving. Some of them because of the agreement with HUD in the Southern District, some of them because of programs that finally got passed at the state level, like the Preservation Trust, some of them other programs that have come through the city or at the federal level and taken some real leadership to move forward. And so there's a lot of interesting implementation to come, but it's really been interesting to watch over these last few years and to cover the challenges at NYCHA to see a lot really starting to move now. And I think Arvind's talk will give us a lot of context for that. So thank you again all for being here. I'll mention very briefly that at the end of Arvind's talk, we will invite people up to these two microphones for a few quick questions for him. And I'll just say ahead of time, please no speeches, just questions for our guest speaker. But Arvind, come on up.
I want to thank Ben for that very generous introduction. I want to thank Dean Crowell and New York Law School for having me here tonight. Thanks to all of you for being here. I cannot believe this room is full. I know the students did not have a choice because your class was required to, but still do appreciate it. As Ben said, my name is Arvind Sohoni, and for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to make you care about public housing. Public housing is government-owned and operated homes that are rented at subsidized rates to families that qualify based on income. In New York, there are about 160,000 apartments housing at least 500,000 New Yorkers in this program. Those apartments are owned and managed by the New York City Housing Authority, which employs 12,000 people, including me. The agency and the program have an existential challenge of managing a frankly insolvent product while also looking for upwards of $70 billion in capital needs, all with the onerous restrictions on government agencies that deliver services. Now, how do I make you care about that? The city has a lot of problems. That is a very big problem on its face. But how do I make you care about this specific problem? I'm going to start by invoking a great alumnus of this school, actually. 90 years ago, Robert F. Wagner, the most productive, interesting, accomplished senator in U.S. history, stepped to the dais at the New York State Democratic Convention. And Wagner delivers probably the best political speech of the 20th century. Mind you, in 1934, it was the first midterm after Roosevelt had been elected in 32, the first referendum on the New Deal and all the programs they had fought for so much. And Wagner says, the goal we have set before our eyes is to create the conditions that make for life worth living for all of our people, to free them from the fear of unjustified wants in this land of plenty, to give to each the unrestricted opportunity for the utmost spiritual development. These are the conditions of true freedom: freedom to live nobly in the present and freedom to look serenely and securely to the future. This is what our patriots fought for. I'm going to tell you a story tonight about people in places at times. It is a history lecture, it is chronological, but that's not that interesting. Any of you can go home tonight and spend enough time in the Times archive or the NYCHA archive and cobble together the same facts that I've got here in this same rough order. The reason this story matters so much is really three things. One, there are 500,000 people at least living in these buildings. That is the most important immediate reason why the story matters so much. Second, this story tells us a lot about the city that we love so much and our attempts to house people over time and our failure in many cases to house people over time. And third, maybe most philosophically, it exposes a lot of fissures in how we think about our duty to each other and what it means to be part of some kind of society. Now, housing as a concept likely predates humans. There's evidence in Tanzania from about 2 million years ago of very basic structures. There's evidence of domesticated fire in France 400,000 years ago, evidence of actual proper homes in Mesopotamia and India and Egypt 10,000 years ago. Once you get into the Roman Empire, the Romans actually built tenement buildings. They had multifamily housing called insulae, and they were very dangerous buildings. Juvenal, the poet, once wrote that we live in a city where most of the buildings are held up by flimsy bits of wood. That's how the owner stops his flats from falling down. He patches up an old crack, then tells us to sleep soundly in a ruin that's about to collapse. Our problems are not new. The challenge of housing people this is not a new challenge that we are facing in any sense of the word. The problem, though, is that the upper bound of what is possible for housing for the wealthiest, for the top earners, has grown quite a bit in 10,000 years. We've learned a lot about architecture and construction and what the upper bound of living can be. We have not moved the lower bound quite so much. The lower bound of what we're comfortable with people living in has not changed all that much, really, in 10,000 years. So by the time the Dutch arrive on this island in 1624, they're fairly sophisticated in building buildings, right? They build houses like those in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Maastricht. They also do make early attempts to regulate zoning. Stuyvesant's codes are full of these very funny attempts to talk about where pigs can go and cannot go or should not go. The Dutch were fairly sophisticated in thinking about zoning and those things early on. Of course, the Dutch, when they arrived, there were 90 native settlements already on the island. They were the first to really build the more permanent structures like this. The British take over the island in 1664. They expand the city limits to the north. They build in their own style at the time. The Dutch do briefly retake Manhattan in 1673 for about 9 months. In those 9 months, they do one thing, which is to pass another hog regulation law. At the time of the Revolution, New York only had 25,000 people. If you ever sort of read a book about the Revolution era or you've watched Hamilton and wonder why everyone knows each other, they did. There were 25,000 people in Manhattan at the time of the Revolution. Starting in 1790, though, the city begins to triple basically every 30 years. So by 1850, all of a sudden, you've got questions on density and crowding. How do we house people at scale? This had not really been a challenge prior to this moment. The most notorious neighborhood where this becomes very prominent is the Five Points. The Five Points was built on top of a contaminated pond. The pond, the collect, had been next to tanneries and slaughterhouses, and all that runoff had basically poisoned the water. And so they built on top of this pond, as you can imagine, very disease-ridden, low land values. They built very poor structures. And obviously this became the first American slum in many ways. It also became a very macabre tourist attraction for people to come and look at the Five Points and gawk at some of the residents. Charles Dickens in 1842, 1 year after the success of Oliver Twist, comes to the Five Points and with 2 escorts goes and says, "This is the place, these narrow ways diverging to the right and left and reeking everywhere with dirt and filth. From every corner as you glance about you in these dark retreats, some figure crawls half awakened, as if the judgment hour were near at hand, and every obscene grave were giving up its dead. Where dogs would howl to lie, women and men and boys slink off to sleep, forcing the dislodged rats to move away in quest of better lodgings." Charles Dickens was not a huge fan of our fair city. And you can dismiss that as saying Charles Dickens was just being British in 1842. But Charles Landman, who was decidedly not British in 1842, also went to the Five Points. And he wrote, "Another room that we entered contained no less than 5 families. And in one corner was a woman in the agonies of death, while at her sides had a miserable dog, howling a requiem over the dying wretch. In another corner lay the helpless form of a boy, about 10 years of age, who was afflicted with the smallpox and had been abandoned to his miserable fate. He had rolled off the straw, and his cheek rested upon the wet floor, which was black with filth." So this was the lower bound of what people were comfortable with their neighbors living in the 1850s. So this is where we're sort of starting the moment of housing reform in many senses. And it's important to think about how American attitudes on poverty also changed around this time. So poverty was not new. It was not new to this country or to the colonies or even to the countries these folks came from. But things did change in the mid-1800s. There was a new strain of anti-poverty thinking coming out of the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches about perfection of the individual. If you spend enough time correcting behaviors, you can actually change someone's ability to be saved in the long run. That is where a lot of the threads of the abolition movement, the temperance movement, and the housing movement all come from that same origin in many ways. They would sort the poor into deserving and undeserving categories, helping the deserving poor and effectively putting the undeserving poor in labor camps or in prisons. This was the way they actually thought about helping people in the 1850s. And this thread runs through the public housing movement even into today and into a lot of our anti-poverty thinking of today. think about means testing and work requirements and the way we think about this fear of people getting something they don't deserve, they've not earned. This same fear, this same thinking comes from this same origin in the 1850s of poverty. Just so you know, these pictures here on the left side, this is an almshouse in Brooklyn. The top right is 3 children living sort of on a grate just below grade. And the bottom right is a gentleman who's actually sleeping at the basement of a police precinct. That was often the housing of last resort in the 1850s for single men, was at the precincts. So out of this moment comes 2 different instincts on housing. One is a regulatory instinct. One says we can pass enough laws to change this behavior. We can pass enough restrictions on building, on real estate to change what's going on here. That led to the Tenement House Acts. So the Tenement House Acts in 67, 79, 1901 were all designed to regulate the way you could build these buildings. The acts were wildly ineffective for several reasons. One being they were not very specific in their writing. In the 67 Act, they wrote about requiring windows in each bedroom. Real estate interests would build 2 buildings with windows that faced each other that could not be opened. 12 years later, the legislature came back and said, actually, we meant windows that faced the sunlight. We want sun to come into these windows. They built the dumbbell tenements with windows that were now about 10 feet apart that became trash chutes that could not be cleaned from the inside. On top of that, there was basically no enforcement. The Tenement House Department did not have nearly enough inspectors to actually go out and enforce these rules on building owners. On the right side of this chart, you'll see the old and new law tenements. These still exist today in New York by construction. So in East Harlem, Lower East Side, you can walk around and actually find these same kinds of structures today. For the true city nerds in the audience, if you're walking around and you see one of these, go to the city planning website, go to Zillow, look it up, find the age. You can kind of guess which one of these it's going to be. The second instinct that comes out of this era is on the supply side. There was an extensive effort to add supply to the housing market. It was also an effort to avoid public housing. All these things were done to avoid the creation of social housing at the time. First, the model tenements. They built these model tenements largely funded by families, by philanthropy. The first one, 1855, the Workman's Home, was built for single Black men. 15 or so years it went on in that fashion, eventually sold to private interests. The building was built to a higher standard of sorts, but actually the plumbing still froze in the wintertime. The toilets were so bad on the upper floors, residents had to come down to the toilet closets on the first 2 floors to use them in the wintertime. Even if these had worked, even if the model tenements had been effective, they were limited by scale. These were funded by individual families. They could not nearly build enough housing to actually house people in New York at any kind of scale that mattered. In the middle, you'll see the amalgamated houses in the Bronx. It still exists today, just south of Van Cortlandt Park, was built under the state's limited dividend law. So 6% return guaranteed to investors to build these kinds of apartments, this being built by a union at the time. On the right side was almost the first public housing site in the city. This is between Christie and Forsyth Streets and Lower East Side, under Mayor Jimmy Walker, who also is an alum of this institution. And as an aside on Jimmy Walker, just for a second, the most interesting person to ever occupy Gracie Mansion, I think, by a mile, although he mostly occupied a suite at the Ritz with his mistress. Wildly corrupt, very effective, which is often a very dangerous combination, too. Chased from office by another alum of this school, Samuel Seabury. Last time I was here, I think there's a Seabury picture in the hallway. I'm not sure if there's a Walker picture in the hallway, but maybe there should be. Okay, justice for Jimmy. Exactly. Dwyer, who became mayor later, actually once said that Jimmy got more done in an hour than the rest of us got done in 12. Dwyer also famously got chased from office in a corruption scandal, too. I won't let Jimmy Walker derail me today, but if you go home tonight, spend 10 minutes just Googling this man. I promise this is going to be worth it because he does not disappoint. Very, very resplendent. While New York was fiddling on the edges of the housing question, Europe was actually doing a lot of this work. So in Vienna and Berlin and Cologne, they were building these social housing palaces. Louis Pink, who I'll talk about more in a second, goes to Europe in the 20s and writes a book about this, A New Day in Housing. And Pink says that Vienna has sacrificed the landlord so the worker can live. And Vienna in particular had a very specific problem after World War I. Vienna had gone from being the seat of a giant empire to the seat of a very small country. And that country had no natural crops, no food, really, no way to feed its people. They made a choice to promote exports. Export promotion meant keeping labor costs and input costs very low. That meant keeping housing costs for workers also quite low. So Vienna became the model for a lot of the early reformers in New York. The math here begins to change during the Depression because all of a sudden you have 33% unemployment in the city. You've got people building these shacks in Central Park. This is along Central Park West. And the math changes because just like the 5 points, you've got proximity of poverty and wealth. You've got poverty in the face of wealthy New Yorkers, and that is changing their considerations on what to do about this question. There had been several attempts to create housing authorities in the late 20s, early 30s. It wasn't until LaGuardia becomes mayor in the beginning of 34 where the momentum really starts to pick up. So the legislature passes the bill in January of 34. Governor Lehman signs the bill quickly after that. The city acts very quickly again on the back end of that. The Housing Authority is created by February of 1934. This is the first board of the agency. In the middle is Langdon Post, the first chair of the agency. He was 34 in this picture. A very famous man. He had been in the assembly himself for quite some time, was married to a very famous socialite, but also a real housing reformer, a real thoughtful person on housing. The agency, the board at least, was going to get sworn in on February 18th, 1934. At 2 o'clock in the morning that day, Langdon Post gets a phone call. And the phone call is from a man named John McElligott, who was the fire commissioner. And McElligott tells Post, hey, there's a giant tenement house fire downtown. The phone call was not, by most accounts, an invitation to come to the fire, but Post does come to the fire from his Park Avenue apartment. By the time he gets there, he watches a building that is basically completely collapsed, completely in ashes. Inside that building were 5 children and 3 adults. 8 deaths on top of several others that had happened that same winter of 34 in the tenements. The next day, Post goes to a luncheon at Hotel Pennsylvania, and he says, the reason this happens is because economically it makes no difference how many times people die in the slums. Someone's always there to replace them, and the owners do not care about this specific issue. And he framed the Housing Authority as a way to address this problem. The Housing Authority came with incredible promise in this moment that it was going to save people from untimely deaths in fires. That was very much how this place was framed when it began. I'll quickly go around the horn with the rest of the board here. To Post's left is Charny Vladik. So Vladik House is in the Lower East Side, a Russian revolutionary. He was chased around by the Tsar in the countryside, jailed several times in Russia, escapes to London, meets Lenin and Trotsky in London, comes to the US, lectures around the Eastern Seaboard, eventually lands in New York, elected to the city council as a socialist in 1917. Really a fascinating person, incredible writer as well. Above him is Louis Pink. So Pink House is in East New York, named for him, longtime government executive, insurance executive. To his right, Reverend Moore, so the Moore houses. Moore had been the head of Catholic Charities, also the head of St. Peter's Church downtown. A very staunch conservative, even by the era's standards, but on housing, rather progressive in his views. The bottom right is Mary Simkovich. Simkovich was perhaps the most thoughtful and experienced housing person of that day. She was a close friend of the Roosevelts. She, along with Catherine Bauer, wrote most of the Housing Act of 37, which we'll talk about in a second. This was front page news, the Housing Authority. For days, this was front page of the New York Times talking about this new tool the city had to fight the scourge of the tenements. Once they had the board, they had to go do something. They had to build something or demolish something, or ideally, they wanted to do both. There was a site from Vincent Astor that had been offered to Post in March of that year. He couldn't accept because there was no money, a theme that continues into today. There was no money to actually even fund the operations, let alone construction of these sites. LaGuardia, for all of his promises and campaign rhetoric on this, did basically nothing in the early years for public housing. No operating money whatsoever. Harold Ickes, who had been the Interior Secretary for Roosevelt, also did nothing. Ickes was famously called the old curmudgeon of the interior by Robert Caro, a name that I'm dying to bestow on many friends of mine. And in this moment, the leading minds in housing say, okay, we have no money, what do we do? And they decide to host a brick sale. They demolished so many tenements, they had these piles of bricks sitting around. They sold bricks in the midst of a global depression to make money. And it sort of worked to keep the doors open in those early days. Post eventually approaches Harry Hopkins, who also worked for Roosevelt in DC, who ran the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And Hopkins gives the money for this first site. Hopkins says, yes, I will pay for construction of this first site. The first thing the agency does when given the money, Hopkins had said to them, I'm only going to pay for rehab, not for new construction. I won't pay for anything new. They get inside the building, they realize these are not savable buildings. They had to actually do basically a gut rehab with the facades kept in place. So the first act of the housing authority with the federal government is to lie to them about what they're doing. Again, a preview of things that happened many times subsequently. This eventually became First Houses on the Lower East Side. It's important to think about who actually moved into First Houses when it was built. So 133 families went into the site. Of those, 81 came from places that had no heat in their apartments prior to this. 91 came from places that had no bathrooms in the unit prior to this. This was an enormous victory for families to get into public housing in these days. First Houses was an actual real step up for families that had been in the tenements in their standard of living. Once you get past First Houses, Harold Ickes reemerges in 35, 36, and the Public Works Administration builds two sites, Harlem River houses for Black families, Williamsburg for white families, very explicitly so, explicitly segregated developments in this era. Quite well built, actually both of them, but also plagued with a lot of lead paint issues given the era they were built in. Williamsburg also led to mass confusion between the housing authority and the federal government. They did not speak to each other in this process, and so they ended up bidding against each other for the same tenements and driving the price up in acquiring the site. The picture here you'll see actually is inside one of those tenements that was acquired and demolished. This is the black and white photo you see on the top right. All of that, those three sites were all built prior to what we consider public housing today. Public housing comes from this, the Housing Act of 1937. The Housing Act created the U.S. Housing Authority, which built sites like Red Hook, Queensbridge, Vladeck, South Jamaica, Classen Point, Kingsborough, low rise, low density, relatively high lot coverage. You can tell these sites by the architecture generally across the city. Despite all of the money that went into those sites at the time, the Housing Act also is responsible for entrenching the American obsession with home ownership. The Housing Act also very much positioned the American economy around home ownership going into the future, which has presented a lot of challenges for rental assistance and other things in the last many decades. It's worth noting just how cheap the agency got quite quickly. And this is largely because of federal pressure on prices. So setting First Houses aside, it was sort of an odd case. Even from Harlem River and Williamsburg down to the U.S. Housing Authority sites, significantly cheaper in construction. This was not efficiency. This was not any kind of innovation. This was largely just being cheap. If you go to these sites today, if you go to Red Hook, you will notice things about that site that you can tell choices that were made in 1939 are still haunting people today. During the war, construction largely halts. Most federal money is going to the war effort. Most other attention is diverted elsewhere. Post himself gets fired during this moment too. And the second chair of the Housing Authority was a man named Alfred Reinstein. And Reinstein actually is the person why this lecture is called American Castles. Reinstein was a real estate leader, and he said, these are not designed to be Maxfield Parrish castles. Maxfield Parrish was a famous artist who drew fantasy depictions with these giant castles. Reinstein said, these are not that. These are meant to be built cheaply. We're going to build cheaply and efficiently. That's the goal of the Housing Authority. And so that became obviously the dominant way these sites were built for quite some time. After the war, the state emerges as the primary financer of housing. These sites were again built quite cheaply. This is also the introduction of Robert Moses onto the scene. Moses effectively runs the housing authority from afar for about a decade. He could not become the chair despite his attempts to do so, but he does effectively run the agency for quite some time. The sites were largely used to house veterans coming back from war, and then later on to house people being removed from other projects that Moses had his eye on. The site on the screen here is Gowanus in Brooklyn. We demolished the site on the left, so these were all the brownstones and tenements and multifamily housing that was taken down, and we built the site on the right. So again, towers in the park. At this era, slightly taller, slightly more dense than the U.S. Housing Authority sites that came before. The city also financed several sites in this era through 4 different programs targeted at different kinds of families. So at St. Mary's Park, for example, rents were actually much higher. The rents were set at the cost of the unit, not to the household income. And so they built a place like St. Mary's Park, much higher fixtures, better landscaping, all those things to actually set higher rents. And in that case, the rents were so high, the project penciled out by itself. There was no subsidy at all. There was no actual city contribution to those sites besides some loan guarantees. They also built these 8 sites at the bottom, these co-ops. These were sold off very quickly, never actually managed by the housing authority. Some would argue, I think, including me, we perhaps should have kept them. I think diversification of the offering would have been very good for residents that have moved on into higher income bands. They could have kept them in these developments, but these were sold off right away before even actually opening their doors. In 48, Truman becomes the first presidential candidate to really talk about public housing as a campaign issue. Obviously, Roosevelt had played a huge role in the growth of the program, but Truman made this an actual campaign issue in his fight against Dewey. Truman eventually, obviously, wins the election and leads to the Housing Act of 1949. The Housing Act authorizes 810,000 public housing units across the country with a goal of doing that by 1955. They hit that number eventually. They hit that number in 1975 because of the war in Korea. Wars in the story often have a way of displacing a lot of domestic priorities. This program, despite also not being a state program, still entrenched more of Moses' authority because Moses was controlling the agency in general. So now all of a sudden you had hundreds of millions of dollars coming into NYCHA being run by basically one man. Again, this picture here is from St. Nicholas. This is a site in central Harlem. These are the brownstones and the multifamily housing on the left that we took down, and then the towers in the park on the right that went up in lieu of them. With all those programs running concurrently, you had this incredible construction boom. Right? You had all of these units coming online around the same time. For 20 years, this agency opened between 6,000 and 8,000 units every single year, a pace that we have never seen since, probably will never see again, unless a handful of us get our way. In 1950 alone, they opened 14,400 units. This was partially because interest rates were very low. There was a ton of federal, state, and city money coming into the system. And they also, NYCHA was a very smart dollar in this era, a very smart maneuver, a manipulator of the market, really, right? This was the smartest dollar in construction in the 1940s into the 1960s. I will say we celebrate this number a lot, but other countries at the same time in Singapore and Hong Kong were doing this probably 4 or 5 times as fast as we were, right? So this was fast by New York standards, but not fast by international standards by any sense. Like I mentioned, the programs were all quite different. We think of public housing as a single program today. It actually was really 8 different programs in this era. Rents were wildly different, set to the cost of construction and maintenance of the unit. The income restrictions were all very different too. If you lived at one of the city 4 sites, you could make 40% more than the median income in that area. So this is actually a much wider swath of population living in public housing in the 1950s. Once you get into the 60s, they start to build taller, more dense, more contextual sites. There are no more vacant outer borough lots available anymore, right? So it's much more opportunistic. Places like Fulton, 830 Amsterdam Avenue. Again, more density, more height is generally the way things go in this moment. This is my favorite slide to show usually, because it's important to think about just what was actually going on in these buildings, not just the buildings themselves, what was happening inside them in this era. And I'll go through the pictures one by one. The top left is Lou Alcindor, who obviously became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a very famous Hall of Fame basketball player, with the NYCHA chairman at the time, holding a basketball camp at Dyckman. In the middle is a young couple getting a key to their apartment. The person handing them the key is Frank Crosswaith, the first Black board member of the Housing Authority. And I love this picture because it shows getting a key to a Housing Authority apartment in this era was an enormous victory. It was an enormous victory for these families and these young couples to get this asset. They really thought this was a step up. This was going to be a real step change in their living conditions. The top right is moving day at Douglas Houses on the Upper West Side. Bottom left, moving day at Brownsville. In the middle, Woodside, and on the right, a couple at Vladeck Houses. So thus far, I've told a fairly positive growth story about the Housing Authority, and you may be wondering, where does it all go wrong? And it goes wrong right here. These charts are from John Lindsay's testimony in 1970 in front of the Senate Banking Committee. John Lindsay became mayor at the end of 65. He goes to DC to testify about the state of the Housing Authority, and he says, things are not good in 1970. There's often a story told about NYCHA's problems being relatively new, being a thing of the last couple decades. What Lindsay is saying in 1970 is actually that's not true. These problems actually existed far before most people realized them to be the case. And what he's pointing to is this chart on the left, and he's saying that expenses are growing so fast, far outpacing revenues. We cannot keep pace like this. Part of that made sense because labor was very cheap in the Depression. And so a lot of these sites had very cheap labor in the first couple decades of their operation. That eventually changed. This is fundamentally the same problem the agency faces today on the operating side. This still exists in the same fashion, probably with those curves diverging even more since this moment. Because again, at this time, rents were still set to the cost of the unit. In the late 60s, that changes. Rent becomes set to household incomes. All of a sudden, if your income is changing, the rent you're paying to the Housing Authority is changing with it. That was not an enormous deal for New York at the time because New York actually had a wealthier clientele of public housing residents compared to other cities in the 60s. That becomes a much bigger problem into the 70s and 80s as you continue into the story. With John Lindsay actually at this testimony was a man named Leroy Adolph, who was the tenant leader at Drew Hamilton Houses. Drew Hamilton also in Central Harlem. And Adolph says, we have been asked many times if public housing is so difficult to live in with, why not leave, move out? Our answer to this is another question. Move out and go where? Back to the slums with the rats and the roaches. Once again, there was nowhere to go. This is still the problem today. There is nowhere to go for a large number of residents. These were serious problems, again, as early as 1970, right? These are not things that happened in the last couple of decades. So that's the financial challenge. The political challenge comes a couple years later. So John Lindsay, Simeon Goler, who was the chair at the time, with federal pressure decided to go build sites in the outer boroughs, to build scattered site housing that's no longer concentrated in the same handful of neighborhoods. The homeowners in Forest Hills revolt against this plan. They hire a lawyer named Mario Cuomo to fight the plan. The Housing Authority wins this battle. This site exists, has been converted to a co-op recently, but the long-term effects of what happened at Forest Hills never really went away. This became a fight about race. This became a perception of the Housing Authority is trying to move Black and brown residents into white homeowner neighborhoods. And that became the dominant fight that happened now at site selection across the city going forward. This never really goes away in the politics of the Housing Authority. And to make that point even more stark, in 1955, NYCHA was predominantly white. More than half of the residents at NYCHA in 1955 were white. By 1985, it was 13% white. Today, it is 4% white. And why do I say this? You cannot tell this story without tying the political outcomes of this program to this chart. It is too big a coincidence that political support for public housing drops basically in line with this chart one for one. That is not an accident. And it's a very important part of the context of what happened with public housing, is that as these things continued, political support all of a sudden, coincidence or not, bottomed out. And what came from that is long-term disinvestment. So Nixon in 73 places a moratorium on new construction altogether. Section 8 is created in 74. There's a real attempt to move things away from the public housing platform. Other cities are demolishing their buildings in this era. The funding cuts continue 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. More restrictions come in the 90s. A fair cloth limit, which limits housing authorities from building above the number of units they had in 1999. We're actually 10,000 units below our limit, so actually we could build 10,000 more public housing units if we had the money. The challenges we face today are not unpredictable. They all came from these decisions that were made to defund the authority, to defund public housing in general. This is what led to things like Hope 6, what led to RAD. This is all about finding alternative ways to finance sites because they had cut Section 9 funding. Hope 6 in New York was largely a non-event besides a couple of catastrophes, basically. It had not been designed really with New York in mind. Other cities got much more money than New York did. They did a couple of sites of work, but at Prospect Plaza in Brooklyn, they vacated a building and did nothing with it. The promise was to rebuild that site. And that site sat empty for about a decade before it was eventually demolished. A little bit later in the story comes sort of a set of social challenges in housing authority development. So drugs and crime and violence. And I mean this in two different respects. I had a resident in Queens tell me that she felt like they lost an entire generation of young men at her development in this era. And that was a very real thing that did happen at these sites. But what also happened is the perception of housing authority sites became this. This was the dominant view of what was going on at NYCHA. Just like Forest Hills, this became, again, a place to be avoided. NYCHA was a bad thing all of a sudden. You should not go there. There's no need to walk through it. You should avoid it if you can. It was a separate city from New York City, a place that you should avoid at all costs. This becomes a giant perception problem for the agency on top of the actual real social problem of families going through this kind of upheaval in that moment. I'd be remiss to not point out the agency itself was also dealing with a lot of internal rot in the 1980s. In the fall of 1983, Stuart Kozloff and Stanley Gardner, who were the manager and assistant supers at Marlborough houses in Brooklyn, approached the agency's general manager saying they have evidence of small-scale corruption. They have evidence of bribery happening at the developments. In December, Kozloff was walking with his two kids in Bensonhurst and was shot once in the thigh. In January, Gardner was found dead in his Staten Island garage with his hands bound behind his back, again with one gunshot to his thigh. Neither crime was ever solved. There was a real internal rot at the agency in many ways in this sort of middle era. There was a lot of untoward things that were going on. These continue into the 90s as well. In 1990, several mafia leaders are indicted on window rigging contracts. So they've basically rigged window bids at the housing authority. They had tried to indict many of these people for years for several crimes, but eventually it is a NYCHA crime that gets them taken down in 1990. All of that leads to increased scrutiny on the agency, most of it rightfully so. Investigations and inquiries into business practices, into the organization continue, and that obviously heightens in the 2010s and leads to the HUD agreement in 2019. I started 10 days after that HUD agreement was signed. It was a very important moment in the agency's history to say, we've done these things in the past, we must change practices going forward. We've done important work in those 5 years to stabilize a lot of the operation. Has it been enough? Not nearly so. Residents still do not see the impacts of a lot of these changes, and I think until that happens, you cannot claim success on any of those programs at the moment. So where does this leave us and what comes next? The buildings are in bad shape. We can decide or argue about how bad they are, but it's not good shape. We certainly know that. Pipes that leak, doors that break, elevators and heating systems that are fairly fragile, the biggest rats you will ever see in your entire life. We have made progress in the last handful of years, I think, but we're also chasing a situation that is getting worse by the day. These buildings are getting worse and worse every single day in many respects. Progress has not been nearly fast enough, and there's a lot more for us to do. One thing I want to make very clear, about this, though, is that behind these walls are still very vibrant and lively communities. And that is very different than what happened in Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia. Those places suffered from enormous vacancies of people leaving public housing in droves. We have not had that same thing in New York, which I think is very important and makes this very much worth fighting for. I had a resident who was a 17-year-old who came to me and said, I'm very scared as my little brother goes to school in the morning and there are some guys that hang out in the hallway. I don't know how to protect him in this case. They're not asking for very much, right? That is a very basic thing that you should be able to feel comfortable with your little brother going to school in the morning. And that I think is still worth us fighting for. There are basically three futures that I think are possible here. One is sort of a status quo. Things continue as they are. There are new programs at hand that are happening to recapitalize buildings, to add more money to the portfolio. Those things may continue at some pace and hopefully can get some good work done. Two, which is the downside case, and this is what happened in Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia, is something bad happens. I think New York is different in enough ways politically, where I think there would be backstops to that if that were to happen. So I think that's probably the least likely of these three. I think the most interesting of the three, though, is to innovate our way out of this problem. And I mean that in a very broad sense of the word. In many ways, we're back in the same spot the 1930s reformers were at. We cannot house people in the city very effectively, whether in public housing or affordable housing in any respect, is an enormous challenge. But there are places that have done this quite well and are doing this at scale that I think is worth looking at. And we've talked to these folks a lot in the last handful of years. I'm going to stop right after this slide. In Paris, they told us on a phone call, they have apartments from 1789 in the public housing system that are now starting to show some wear and tear. Some wear and tear on the 1789 Revolution era apartments. It's because they've invested enormous amounts of money in those apartments. They've invested incredible sums of money in keeping those apartments open and available to residents. Vienna obviously was the model for the Housing Authority to start. Vienna has continued that program in many ways and expanded on it. Both of these cities actually have more public housing than we do in that sense. In Singapore, 80% of residents live in public housing. 80% of residents live in public housing. It's all of different kinds. Some of it is actually sold to people once it's built. Some of it is rental. But this is not a thing that is considered anything untoward or different from the market itself. I think what's interesting also in growing economies in Ethiopia, for example, they're actually sort of where Vienna was in 1930, trying to grow exports in many ways, building public housing now for the first time to house workers in cities as people move to cities on the continent. We can do versions of these things. None of them are perfect. None of them are going to solve the problem on their own, but they require a different way of thinking about housing in New York. I think, and again, this is my opinion, not speaking for the agency, housing is too important to leave alone to a supply-constrained market. What we do at NYCHA is actually extremely important in housing New Yorkers in this way. The state, I think, has to play an enormous role going forward in providing housing in some respect for people in New York City. And the last thing I will say, and then I promise I will shut up, to the students in the room in particular, if you are looking for a thing to dedicate your career to or a thing to go work on, I promise you will not be disappointed doing this. Doesn't mean working for me or working for the Housing Authority. You can go work for Lucy Newman at Legal Aid. You can go work at a think tank. You can go work with the residents who are suing the Housing Authority. It doesn't matter which part of it you're doing. You will not be disappointed working on this issue. This is going to be a generational issue for a long time. We cannot house people anymore. And it's a very fundamental need and a right to have that. And so I would say, come do this. There's a lot of things you can do, but come do this one. I think you won't regret it. I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you, Arvind. We'll take a few questions for Arvind. Like I said at the beginning, please try to just come up and ask a question. If you need to give a little context, great. But go ahead and come up to the mics. We'll take a few questions here for Arvind. Go ahead, start us off.
Okay, is there any reason why it takes the NYCHA takes such a time making repairs? Is there any particular why we can't put people in public housing anymore? This state is a rich state. It's a richer state.
Yeah, this is a great question. So the question is, why does NYCHA take so long making repairs? And then two, obviously that causes problems with turnover and you can't get people to move into units when they're vacant. This is actually in the papers as of last week about our vacancy issues. So on the issues with timing of repairs, I think one, there's no real excuse for how long things take sometimes. What I will say is the volume of repairs that come into the Housing Authority are enormous. So in every year, 3.3 million work order tickets are generated at Housing Authority sites. Those are all obviously completed by a combination of maintenance workers and trades workers and things like that. That is still far too slow, though. We have residents that are waiting months to get a plumber to come to their unit, plaster get their unit. Part of that is a funding challenge. We would love, I think my team here would tell you, they would love to add hundreds of skilled trades workers to do that work faster. The agency at this point basically does not have the funding to do that. But I'd agree with your premise 100% that there's no way that the current state is acceptable, right? It doesn't make sense to residents or to many of us either. To your second question, it causes a backlog of apartments being turned over because all of a sudden, if you can't do repairs, you can't move someone new into the unit. I was at East River Houses last week and I saw a handful of open windows with nothing inside. And I asked, well, what's going on? There's like, well, these are all vacant because they haven't turned them over yet. Part of that is because the extensive lead and asbestos issues in these developments. The amount of time it takes to abate lead and asbestos in one of these sites can be very, very long. And that is often what is causing the huge backlog in those vacancies. But again, I think that is largely a resource challenge that we can solve. We need to sort of solve those now because there's no reason to have residents on a waiting list, 200,000 people on a waiting list with 5,000 apartments open. It doesn't make sense.
Thank you.
So the waiting list has been closed for quite some time. At that time, there was about 250,000 people on that waiting list. It may have fluctuated a little bit since then. There's a question here.
Hi, this might be a little controversial considering it's newer news. You had recently spoken about social challenges and organizational decline and how there's kind of a built stigma towards NYCHA. And I know that recently the scandal was released with NYCHA and about the whole sting operation. So I just want to see how NYCHA is addressing it and trying to move forward from it in order to get away from that organizational stigma.
Sure. I want to make sure I know which scandal you're referring to. I assume you mean the bribery charges
Yes.
okay. So 3 weeks ago, 55 current employees of NYCHA and 15 retirees were arrested and charged with bribery and extortion on small procurement contracts. A couple things that I'll say, and obviously we've got the official statements that I can refer you to too. The reason that program existed of developments actually doing these micro purchases of small procurements is actually designed to do the work faster. That's the reason that program exists to begin with. To the point before, why is it so slow? That actually was an attempt to do things quicker, to get someone who works in the neighborhood to come do that work. The problem, though, is that a place this big with this much scale, right, 12,000 employees across 250 sites, it is often very difficult to police every single person and what they're doing day to day. That does not mean we don't have to do a much better job of doing that. And obviously, we've spent a lot of time and the executive team at NYCHA in those last 3 weeks thinking about what are all the things we have to go do to make sure this is not happening again. But it is, in many ways, a function of the scale of the place. An agency this big with this much money coming through it, this dispersed, can have these problems before. And it has happened before, too. In the 80s, there were similar charges. In the 90s, there were similar charges. But again, I think at this point in time, we have to do everything we can to make sure it's not happening anymore. But it does not, certainly to your other question, help the perception of this place one bit.
Hi, I came to New York to go to law school, moved away, went to the Army, come back several times. I grew up in Baltimore, where the McCullough Homes was another New Deal public housing project that Blacks moved into largely. But I moved back to New York to take over the drought effort some years ago when New York was going through a major drought. And I was hired, I came down, met the mayor, got an office, hired a staff. And then some of my inspectors were telling me that NYCHA inspectors, people that worked at NYCHA under the micro contracts, where a contract under $10,000 did not have to be collectively bid. Yep. It could actually be assigned And some of the guys who worked for me would come, Mr. Nicholson, you know how many NYCHA contracts there are for repairs at $9,999?
Sure.
One of my guys told me about an apartment, a NYCHA complex in the Bronx where light bulbs were put in, 1,000 light bulbs at $780 per light bulb
Sure.
by a New York City electrical contractor.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, I got kids in law school and medical school, and if they told me they wanted to go work in public housing,
Yeah.
I'd have to say, we got to go for a walk.
Yeah. That's what my parents said too. So no, it's a great question. So, you know, there's one of the interesting things about that is, you know, there's an absurdity to the facts of some of these cases, right? There's sort of a absurdity to the fact that the place has been run like that for some time and has had those issues with people hitting the caps, things like that. The reason, though, it is a problem, obviously, it's wasteful, but the two reasons it actually matters so much is that, one, it certainly does ruin the integrity of the agency in many ways, but most importantly, it denies services from the residents who need them, right? Residents are actually waiting for that work to get done. If you have some kind of graft in the process, you're obviously taking away from that. So I grant your premise, but I still think if the students want to come work at the Housing Authority, they should. No, you're good. You're good. Yeah. Vicki.
First of all, Arvind, just want to say to you and your team, thank you on behalf of all of New Yorkers. I know how hard this work is, and you all have done just an amazingly creative and thoughtful job. So you've got a long way to go, we all know, but you've done an amazing job. But given your broad sweep and historical look, I wonder what you would say to a lot of the folks today who are arguing that the solution to our housing problems is social housing, right? Is Vienna type of social housing. Of course, that didn't work out so well with NYCHA, which really was a social housing model. So what would you advise to all of the folks who are now calling for social housing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's maybe sort of the ultimate question here, I think, in some ways. I think if you want to do it, so assume for a second that you want to do that, right? Assume someone wants to promote social housing as a solution to a much bigger problem, right? To the fact that many people now outside of public housing can't afford to live really anywhere in New York. One, to do that, I think you have to really understand what went wrong here. And there's sort of two theories of that. One, you could believe this program was so poisoned deliberately over time with the sort of deliberate defunding of it and some of the restrictions on it, that if you get around those same issues, you could actually design this in a way that it could be productive and could be different. I think right now that is very hard to do because those same forces still exist in the same way. They have not gone away. In many ways, they've actually exacerbated quite a bit since the 1970s. And so while I think I share that goal, I think in philosophy, it's a very difficult thing for me to picture in the next handful of years, just given all of those forces. I think politics have to change in a generational kind of way before that'd be a possibility. And again, on the operational side, you have to really understand what went wrong in these sites. How much can you attribute to architecture failures or other design flaws that went into these sites? And if you can't, and if there's sort of a bigger issue with that, I think your answer is that it's probably difficult to do so.
Hi, wonderful lecture, but I want the next chapter. Could you please tell us where the money's going to come from? What are the plans? How are you going to close that gap? All the needs you did great. Now tell us a little bit more about your prospects on the money.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question.
Just before you answer,
Yeah.
we'll make that the last question so nobody else jump up, please. We'll wrap it.
I think it's a very difficult question. That is, again, that is the Housing Authority's primary challenge right now is how do you actually fund these sites in some sustainable way? I don't know the answer to that question right now. There was a moment two and a half years ago where we really did think there was a check coming from the federal government. There had been many statements made from many elected officials about the promise of Section 9 funding coming to New York. I think that would have been transformational in a sense to the program. That could have been a complete renewal of the program in a way. Without that, I don't know the answer. Obviously, there are things that are happening now in converting sites to Section 8 to try and take advantage of the subsidy. Those are not perfect. Those are things that have been used to do that, to try and take advantage of federal programs. But I don't know, honestly. And that's the scariest part of this story, is that it's not quite clear, given the federal attitudes on public housing that have existed now for, again, 50 years, It's not clear. And I think that is perhaps the scariest moment about public housing is without that, there is this moment in the next sort of 20, 30 years where there's sort of this really judgment call to make in New York about what do we do with this? How do we find ways to fund this? Can we self-subsidize in the city? If you think about back when Battery Park started, everyone was fighting over those dollars. Everyone was fighting over how do we get that spin-off cash? There are things like that that we should still be thinking about. Are there other ways for the city or the state or the feds to subsidize this program outside of the traditional path? But it's not easy.
We do have a dean's prerogative here, so I take back. what I said.
I'm just going to let Nicole say a few words.
Sorry, I know we were told not to make speeches. I'll try to make this more of a comment. Arvind set me up with such a nice softball when he talked about how meaningful work in public housing is. We do have a very robust internship program. I'm over human resources in case you can't tell. If you're interested, there's information available on career planning. Arvind's correct. Working in housing will be one of the most fulfilling, challenging, meaningful, no day is like another experiences. So look into it. Thank you.
And please, one more hand for Arvind for that great presentation. Thank you all very much for coming. Please have a little more food and drink before we head out.